Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 1. Today we are going to explore the growing power of the Roman Catholic Church. And as always, there are a number of things that you should keep track of while watching this lecture. And so they are in the upper left-hand side of the screen. And then there are some things that you should keep track of as far as places that you should be able to place on a map. And they are on the lower left-hand part of the screen. So with that said, let's get to it. We spent a lot of time talking about the church and its role in Western civilization. That's because the Christian church has been one of the most important and longest-lasting institutions in the history of the West. In the 4th century, the church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. This gave the church and church officials significant power. With the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, the church's role changed. As we have discussed, it was now a significant force for preserving knowledge and education, as well as civilization itself. It was church leaders that converted the barbarian tribes that overthrew Rome, for example. Moreover, despite the fall of the Roman Empire, the church maintained the same organization that had developed within that empire. That organization was based upon the 5 major cities within the empire. They included Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria in Egypt. Each of the 5 centers was governed by a bishop. Given the importance of Rome within the Roman Empire, the Bishop of Rome considered himself to be the most powerful and important of these leaders. This can be seen in his use of the term pope, which meant father. Still, the other leaders wielded significant power as well. Constantinople, for example, was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, known to us today as the Byzantine Empire. Jerusalem was important due to its role in the history of Christ and the Christian Church. The same could be said of Antioch, which today is located in the nation of Turkey. Finally, Alexandria had been a major city of learning and scholarship since it was founded by Alexander the Great. It remained one of the grandest cities even after the fall of Rome in 476. Here is a map of the 5 centers of early Christianity. By the time we reach the end of the first millennium in 1000 CE, the church has become a much weaker institution in the West. Why? Well, one reason has to do with the nature of medieval society. Over time, the church came under the influence of powerful landholders, most of whom controlled powerful armies of knights and warriors. These landholders were able to use their power to exercise significant control over the church. Landlords used this power in a number of ways. One was something called simony. Simony referred to the practice of selling church offices to the highest bidder. Bishops, archbishops, and cardinals within the church controlled significant wealth. Many lived like the wealthiest nobility. Thus, these offices were highly prized. So desirable were they that powerful landlords often sold these offices to the highest bidder, regardless of whether or not the person was qualified. In fact, qualifications didn't matter. All that mattered was whether or not you could pay. A related issue was that of lay investiture. This was the belief that secular leaders had the power to appoint church leaders. Hence, a church official owed his position to a lay leader, such as a king or a duke, rather than to the church or the pope. Moreover, the rise of Islam in the 7th century proved to be a major challenge to Christianity. The faith established by Muhammad swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in 632 CE and captured much of the Middle East, including several of the centers of the Christian Church. As the map indicates, 3 of the 5 centers of Christianity fell to Islam by 1000 CE. They included Alexandria, Antioch, and even the holy city of Jerusalem. Only Constantinople and Rome remained outside of Islamic control. Finally, relations between the 2 remaining Christian centers became strained by the middle of the 11th century. The 2 churches long had their differences. These differences included things like when Easter should be celebrated, and the importance of icons and imagery within the church. Other divisions were cultural. The Church of Rome, for example, used Latin as its preferred language, while the church in Constantinople spoke Greek. Things came to a head in 1054 CE, when Pope Leo sent an emissary to meet with the Bishop of Constantinople. Leo claimed that as Bishop of Rome he was the leader of all Christians. The Bishop of Constantinople denied this claim, and treated the Pope's emissary rudely. Leo responded by excommunicating the Bishop of Constantinople. Excommunication was the worst thing a church official could do to a Christian because it essentially meant throwing him or her out of the church by denying them access to communion. One who was excommunicated was thought to be condemned to hell in the afterlife. The Bishop of Constantinople did not worry too much about it, however, and responded by excommunicating Leo. The divide between the church in Rome and the church in Constantinople became known as the Great Schism, and it remained in effect until 1965. That's right, 1965. By the end of the 11th century, the fortunes of the papacy and the church began to change. The church began to assert greater and greater power, and it began with the rise of Pope Gregory VII in 1075 CE. Gregory agreed with his predecessor, Leo IX, that as God's representative on earth, he wielded special power that exceeded even that of kings and queens. In 1075 CE, he decided to test this authority in a clash that arose with the most powerful ruler in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV. As emperor, Henry claimed that he, not the Pope, was God's chosen representative on earth. As such, only he could appoint church officials within his kingdom, which included much of modern-day Germany and northern Italy. The issue came to a head when Henry insisted on appointing a bishop in the city of Milan. Gregory condemned the emperor's move, claiming that only he could appoint church officials. Ultimately, Gregory called for a church council, which ultimately voted to reject Henry's appointment. Then they took things a little farther. They voted to excommunicate the emperor. Why was this so important? In this statement of excommunication, the Pope said, quote, "I deprive King Henry IV, son of the Emperor Henry III, who has rebelled against God's church with unheard of audacity, of the government over the whole kingdom of Germany and Italy, and I release all Christian men from the allegiance which they have sworn or may swear to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king." Listen to what Gregory is saying here. He is not only throwing Henry out of the church, and thereby condemning him to hell, he is also denying Henry's position as leader of the Holy Roman Empire, and telling his subjects to rebel against his rule. This was just the excuse that Henry's enemies needed to begin working to overthrow the emperor. Things became so desperate that Henry traveled to meet with Gregory at a castle in Tuscany. According to legend, Pope Gregory refused to leave the castle, however, and so Henry stood outside in the snow, in his bare feet for 3 days, begging for forgiveness. Ultimately, the Pope relented and reinstated Henry into the church. The significance of the investiture controversy, as it became known, is that it asserted the power of the church over secular officials and leaders. This was a significant expansion in the power of the church and the Pope. But Gregory did not stop there. He also began to militarize the church by asserting still more powers. This militarization of the church is connected to the concept of feudalism, a social and economic system that governed relations between people in medieval Europe. Feudalism divided society into inferiors and superiors. Under this arrangement, those who were considered inferior owed service, taxes, and military service to their superiors. Gregory VII argued that as head of God's kingdom, all of Europe's people were his inferiors. Therefore, they owed him military service. He called this concept Fidelis Beati Petri, and as head of the church, he had the right to command God's army on earth. He took it even farther, however. He argued that giving military service to the Pope could be interpreted as penance. In other words, a knight who agreed to fight for the church could be granted forgiveness for his sins. This was important in a society where fear of hell was incredibly strong. This is going to be the idea that will lead us to the Crusades. But it won't be Gregory who will fully realize the militarization of the Christian church. Instead, that will be his successor, Pope Urban II. Urban was a strong supporter of Gregory and his assertion of expanding church power. In 1095 CE, Urban will call for a general meeting of church officials in the city of Clermont, in central France. At this council, Urban will lay the foundation for the First Crusade. In a speech to church officials assembled there, he described a series of atrocities perpetrated by Muslims against Christians living under their control. As he said, quote, "A race absolutely alien to God has invaded the land of the Christians, has reduced the people with sword, rapine, and flame. These men have destroyed the altars, polluted by their foul practices. They have circumcised the Christians, either spreading the blood from their circumcisions on the altars, or pouring it into the baptismal fonts. And they cut open the navels of those whom they choose to torment with loathsome death, tear out their most vital organs and tie them to a stake, drag them around and flog them, before killing them as they lie prone on the ground with all their entrails out. What shall I say of this appalling practice? This appalling violation of women, of which it is more evil to speak than to keep silent." Then he went further. "On whom, therefore, does the task lie of avenging this, of redeeming this situation, if not on you, upon whom all nations of God has bestowed outstanding glory in arms, magnitude of heart, litheness of body and strength, to humble anyone who resists you?" In other words, the Pope is calling on Christians across Europe to rescue their oppressed brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. Like Gregory VII, Urban has tied the idea of service in God's army to the concept of forgiveness or of sins. In other words, those who fight in this crusade would receive a forgiveness of their sins. So, what drove the men of Western Europe to leave their homes and embark on a very difficult and dangerous crusade far from home? Well, we've already discussed one motive. The forgiveness of sins was a powerful incentive to people who believed that hellfire and damnation were a very real part of the afterlife. But the Crusaders were also motivated by the desire to liberate the Holy Land, and especially the city of Jerusalem, from Islamic control. Why was this so important? To answer this question, we need to understand the critical and symbolic place that Jerusalem held in the minds of medieval Christians. Jerusalem was considered to be the center or navel of the world. Maps placed the holy city of Jerusalem at the very center of the world, with the continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia surrounding it. Why was Jerusalem so important? Well, not only was it one of the 5 major cities of the early church, it was also a city that Jesus knew. Jesus walked its streets. He celebrated the Last Supper there. He was tortured and crucified there. He was also buried there, and 3 days later rose from the dead. The city was littered with holy sites, including Jesus' tomb, which was known as the Holy Sepulchre. Urban was sure to play upon this loyalty to Jerusalem in his speech, as he declared, quote, "You dearest brothers must take the greatest pains to try to ensure that the holiness of that city and the glory of his sepulchre will be cleansed. You, Christian soldiers, may justly defend the freedom of the fatherland by the exercise of arms. And if you believe that you ought to take great pains to make a pilgrimage to the graves of the apostles in Rome, or to the shrines of any other saints, what expanse of spirit can you refuse in order to rescue and make a pilgrimage to the cross, the blood, the sepulchre?" So, we've laid in place both the history of the church in about 1000 CE. This history has shown us a church that is expanding in its power, a church that is claiming greater and greater influence over Christians in Europe. We also see that this influence is having, I guess, an influence over the Christian people of Europe, including the soldiers who are going to be asked to go off and fight in the Crusades. That is going to be a subject that we are going to study in an upcoming lecture.